The leather of the driver's seat was the color of dried blood and felt like butter against my fingertips. It was a ridiculous, beautiful, impossibly expensive thing. A Bentley Continental GT, painted in a shade of red so deep it seemed to swallow the sterile white light of the showroom. I had been circling it for 20 minutes, running a hand over the perfect curve of its fender, breathing in the scent of wealth that clung to it like a fine cologne. It was the scent of new leather, of precision engineering, of a world so far removed from the one I was born into that it felt like a different planet. My dress, a simple cream-colored sheath, felt inadequate under the aggressive glare of the overhead lights. At 22, I knew I looked young, and I knew how my dark skin and the simple elegance of my dress registered in a place like this. I was a curiosity, an anomaly to be observed and eventually dismissed. I had felt the manager's eyes on me since I walked in, a heavy, assessing gaze that stripped me down and found me wanting. His name, according to the polished silver plaque on his desk, was Mr. Henderson. He was a man built of soft angles and expensive fabrics, with a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. He finally decided to approach, his loafers making no sound on the gleaming marble floor. He moved like a man who owned every inch of the space he occupied. "Can I help you, miss?" The question was a formality, his tone already bored. He wasn't asking if he could help me buy. He was asking what I was doing here, touching the merchandise. "I'd like to know the final drive-out price for this model," I said, my voice even. I refused to let him intimidate me. I had practiced this moment in my head. I had the cashier's check from a private sale of my grandmother's property folded neatly in my purse. It was my money, my choice. A final, extravagant tether to a life I was leaving behind, and a first step into a new one. Henderson's eyes flickered over my dress, my simple gold earrings, the single bracelet on my wrist. A little smirk played on his lips. "This is the Continental GT Speed. Fully loaded. It's a significant investment." "I'm aware," I said, keeping my gaze locked on the car. I didn't want to look at him, to see the dismissal I knew was plain on his face. "I have the financing arranged. I just need the final number, including taxes and fees." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Financing can be tricky for a vehicle in this bracket. Perhaps I could show you one of our certified pre-owned models? Something a little more accessible." The condescension was a physical thing, a pressure building in my chest. Accessible. He meant for someone like me. He saw a young black woman in a simple dress, and his mind filled in a story of delusion and bad credit. He had no idea who I was, and he had no interest in finding out. He had already passed his verdict. "I'm not interested in pre-owned," I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. "I am interested in this car. In this color. If you don't want to sell it to me, I'm sure another dealership will be happy to take my money." That was a mistake. His smile vanished completely. The practiced veneer of customer service cracked, revealing the raw arrogance beneath. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, insulting whisper. "We have a certain clientele to maintain. We can't just have anyone taking test drives for their social media profiles. If you're not a serious buyer, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." My blood ran cold, then hot. The humiliation was a sharp, metallic taste in the back of my throat. Other customers, older, paler, dressed in the casual signifiers of wealth, were beginning to look over. They saw the scene, the important-looking manager, the out-of-place girl. Their faces were blank, but I could feel their judgment. "I am a serious buyer," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I opened my purse, my hand trembling slightly as I pulled out the folded check. I didn't want to show it to him. It felt like bearing a part of my soul. But he had backed me into a corner. I unfolded it and held it out. "Is this serious enough for you?" He glanced at the check, at the 6 figures written in neat black ink. For a heartbeat, his composure faltered. Surprise, then suspicion, flickered in his eyes. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into something even uglier. He didn't take the check. "That doesn't prove anything," he sneered. "I've seen fakes better than that. I think you've been here long enough. Please leave."
Now.
He gestured to a security guard standing near the entrance, a bulky man in an ill-fitting suit. The guard started toward us, his expression impassive. This was it. This was the moment it became a scene. The moment my quiet attempt to buy myself something beautiful turned into a public shaming. I folded the check, my fingers stiff, and put it back in my purse. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I would not cry. I would not give him the satisfaction. I turned, my back straight, and prepared to walk out of that showroom and never look back. But the security guard was there, blocking my path. He put a hand on my arm. It wasn't rough, but it was firm. A gesture of removal, of ownership over the space I was trespassing in. And that was the moment everything changed. The heavy glass doors of the showroom hissed open, and the oppressive, climate-controlled air seemed to drop 20 degrees. A silence fell over the room, a sudden, absolute hush that was more profound than any noise. The low chatter of the other customers died. The hum of the lights seemed to fade. He stood in the doorway, framed against the bright afternoon sun. He wasn't tall, not overwhelmingly so, but he occupied the space as if he had carved it from the air for himself. His suit was charcoal gray, a Tom Ford creation that fit his lean frame with surgical precision. He didn't move. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, his presence a gravitational force that pulled all attention toward him. It was my husband, Jin-Woo Kwon. He hadn't told me he was coming. He never did. His movements were his own, governed by a logic I was not privy to. We had been married for 6 months, an arrangement born of his world and my desperation. It was a marriage of quiet, separate rooms and dinners eaten in a silence, so thick I could feel it in my bones. I knew what he was, what he did. I knew he was the hidden king of a brutal empire that stretched from Seoul to Los Angeles. But I had never seen that part of him. The man I lived with was quiet, reserved, almost unnervingly still. His eyes, dark and intelligent, watched everything, but he rarely spoke. Now, seeing him in the doorway of this brightly lit showroom, I saw the other man, the one the world whispered about. The predatory stillness, the absolute certainty in his posture. His gaze swept the room once, a quick, dismissive inventory, before it landed on the security guard's hand on my arm. His eyes narrowed, and the change was terrifying. The polite, distant mask was gone. What was left was cold, ancient, and lethal. He moved then, not fast, but with a deliberate, fluid grace that was more menacing than any sprint. The floor didn't seem to dare make a sound beneath his shoes. Mr. Henderson, puffed up with his petty victory, didn't recognize the danger. He saw an immaculately dressed Asian man and registered him only as another potential customer, an interruption. "Sir, can I help you?" Henderson asked, his voice still carrying the edge of authority he'd used on me. Jin-Woo did not look at him. His eyes were still fixed on the hand gripping my arm. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, cedar, and something that smelled like cold smoke. He didn't look at me either. He looked at the guard. "Take your hand off my wife," he said. His voice was low, almost conversational, but it cut through the silence of the showroom like a shard of glass. It held no heat, no anger. It was something far worse. It was a statement of absolute fact, a promise of inevitable consequence. The guard snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He took a clumsy step away, his professional composure shattering. Jin-Woo's gaze finally shifted to me. His dark eyes searched my face, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker there. It wasn't tenderness. It was something harder, sharper. A question. He lifted his hand and gently, so gently it was almost imperceptible, his thumb brushed over the spot on my arm where the guard had touched me. It was a gesture of erasure. Then he turned his head, just slightly, and his eyes found Mr. Henderson. The manager, finally sensing the seismic shift in the room's power dynamic, was beginning to look uneasy. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Jin-Woo said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "My wife, Chloe, was attempting to purchase a vehicle. Henderson's face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from Jinwoo's flawlessly tailored suit to my simple dress and back again. The math was not adding up in his small, prejudiced world. "You're your wife?" he stammered, a sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. "I'm sorry, sir. There was no indication." He trailed off, realizing that anything he said would only dig his grave deeper. "She what?" Jinwoo's voice was soft, coaxing. It was the most dangerous sound I had ever heard. "Please finish your sentence." "She what? Did not look like she belonged here? Did not look like she could afford it? Did not look like she should be married to me?" The silence stretched, thin and tight. Henderson's face had gone from pink to a pasty white. He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route, but two more men had appeared at the entrance, as silent and well-dressed as Jinwoo. They weren't security. They were soldiers. Jinwoo took a step toward Henderson, who flinched back. "You embarrassed her," Jinwoo stated, as if discussing the weather. "You put your hired muscle's hands on her." In public, he paused, his head tilting slightly. "This is a problem." I should have been horrified. A part of me was. This was the violence I had agreed to live alongside, the power I had accepted in exchange for safety. But watching the color drain from Henderson's face, watching him shrink and tremble before my husband's quiet wrath, another feeling rose up in me, dark and shameful. It was satisfaction. It was vindication. "Sir, I apologize," Henderson stuttered, his eyes darting to the two men at the door. "It was a terrible mistake. Please, whatever she wants. The car, it's a gift. On the house. Please." Jinwoo smiled. It was a chilling, terrible thing, all sharp edges and no warmth. "A gift," he repeated softly. "You think you can buy your way out of disrespecting my family? You think a car erases the insult?" He looked back at me. "Chloe, do you want his gift?" I met his gaze. In their dark depths, I saw the truth of our arrangement laid bare. He was offering me a choice. I could be the frightened woman who wanted this to stop, or I could be his wife. The wife of Jinwoo Kwon. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I don't want his gift. I want to buy the car." Jinwoo's smile widened, just a fraction. It reached his eyes this time, a glint of something that might have been approval. Or possession. "You hear her," he said to Henderson, his voice once again flat and cold. "She will buy the car. You will sell it to her at a $1 discount. For the inconvenience." He then glanced at the two men he'd brought with him. He said something in Korean, his tone clipped and final. It was an order. The men moved forward. They didn't run. They simply walked, one to each side of Mr. Henderson. They each placed a hand on his arms, their grips gentle but inescapable. What are you doing?" Henderson squeaked, his voice cracking with terror. "We're going to discuss the terms of your continued employment," Jinwoo said smoothly. He turned his back on the terrified manager, dismissing him from existence. The men led Henderson toward a back office, his pleas dissolving into whimpers. The showroom was utterly silent, the remaining staff and customers frozen in place, pretending not to see, not to hear. That was the moment I could have run. I could have screamed, protested, told him he'd gone too far. I could have rejected the violence done in my name. It would have been the right thing to do. The moral thing. I did not move. I stayed right where I was, at my husband's side. I had made a deliberate choice when he asked me about the car. I had chosen his world over the one that had just tried to expel me. Jinwoo looked at me, his face unreadable. "The paperwork will be brought to you," he said. "Wait here." He started to turn, to follow his men, to finish what he had started. "Jinwoo," I said, and he stopped. He looked back, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Thank you," I whispered. He just nodded, a short, sharp gesture. Then he was gone, disappearing into the back of the showroom, leaving me alone in the cathedral-like silence, the blood-red Bentley gleaming beside me like a prize. Or a warning. The silence in the car, on the way home, was a living thing. It had weight and texture. I sat in the passenger seat of Jinwoo's black sedan, the kind of car that is invisible in its luxury, and stared out at the blur of the city. The red Bentley was being delivered, a detail handled with terrifying efficiency by one of his men. I hadn't even had to sign anything. A man I'd never seen before, with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, had appeared with a tablet, told me everything was complete, and bowed. Jinwoo drove with an economy of motion, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He hadn't spoken a word since we left the dealership. He hadn't needed to. The air was thick with what had happened, with the quiet, brutal display of power I had witnessed. It was one thing to know in an abstract way that my husband was a dangerous man. It was another to see him dismantle another person's world with a few quiet words. I kept thinking of Mr. Henderson's face, the way his arrogance had curdled into pure terror. I wondered what was happening to him in that back room. I told myself I didn't care. He had humiliated me. He deserved it. But the thought was a cold stone in my stomach. I risked a glance at Jinwoo. His profile was carved from stone, his jaw tight. He was looking at the road, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. His mind was somewhere else. I remembered a story he'd told me once, in the very early days of our marriage. It was a rare crack in his armor, a moment of unguarded honesty, so startling I wasn't sure I hadn't imagined it. He'd spoken of his older sister, how she had been in love with a man from a rival family, how her own family had disowned her and his had tormented her. He spoke of a specific incident, a public shaming at a restaurant, where she had been refused service, insulted, and made to feel small, while her lover did nothing. Jinwoo had been a teenager then, powerless, watching from the sidelines as his sister's spirit was broken. She had taken her own life a year later. He had never forgiven himself for not being strong enough to protect her. Looking at him now, at the cold fury simmering just beneath his skin, I understood. His reaction at the dealership wasn't just about me. It was about her. Henderson hadn't just insulted his wife. He had stepped on the grave of Jinwoo's greatest failure. He had become the ghost Jinwoo had been hunting his entire life. The knowledge didn't make what he did right, but it colored it in shades of grief and rage that I could, terrifyingly, understand. The wound had been revealed. He must have felt my eyes on him because he turned his head and met my gaze. The car was stopped at a red light, trapping us in an intimate bubble of silence. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools, but the anger was still there, banked like coals. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Yes," I said. It was the truth. I wasn't scared. I wasn't hurt. I was something else. Something complicated and unsettling. "He will not be a problem again," Jinwoo stated. It was a promise. A vow. The light turned green, and he accelerated smoothly. We didn't speak again until we pulled into the long, private driveway of our house, a modern fortress of glass and steel nestled in the hills, overlooking the city. The red Bentley was already there, parked in the circular drive, gleaming under the late afternoon sun. It looked like a drop of blood on a white canvas. An employee from the dealership, not Henderson, a young, nervous-looking man, was standing beside it, holding a small velvet box. He bowed low as Jinwoo's car approached. We got out. Jinwoo took the box from the young man and dismissed him with a curt nod. The man practically ran back to the waiting tow truck. Jinwoo walked over to me and held out the box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a single, heavy key fob with the Bentley crest. I looked from the key to the car, then to my husband. This was the moment. The point of no return. Accepting the car, accepting this key, was accepting everything that came with it. The violence, the power, the fear he wielded like a weapon. It was an act of complicity. A morally gray choice that I knew would stain me forever. I was crossing a line I could never uncross. I reached out and took the key. My fingers closed around it, the metal cool and solid against my palm. "Thank you," I said again. A muscle worked in his jaw. "What is mine," he said, his voice low and intense, "is protected. Absolutely." It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of ownership. a confession of his own possessive, dangerous nature. You are mine. Therefore, you are safe. Therefore, anyone who touches you will be destroyed. The tension between us was a wire-pulled taut, humming with unspoken things. I told myself I had married him for the security he offered, a shield against a world that had always been unkind. But in that moment, watching him stand there with the city sprawling below us, a king in his castle, I admitted a darker truth to myself. I stayed because a part of me was drawn to the terrifying certainty of his power. That night, one of his lieutenants arrived. A man named Mr. Choi, who always moved with a quiet deference that did nothing to hide the hardness in his eyes. He and Jinwoo met in the study, but their voices carried. I shamelessly stood in the shadows of the hallway and listened. The Choi family saw everything, the lieutenant reported. One of their men was at a cafe across the street. They see the public display as a weakness. A new variable. A variable? Jinwoo's voice was dangerously soft. They believe your wife is a vulnerability they can exploit. A car was seen following you from the dealership. We have the plate. It belongs to Choi Min-jun's personal security team. My blood ran cold. The enemy was no longer an arrogant car salesman. It was a rival organization, a group of men who operated by the same brutal code as my husband. And because Jinwoo had defended me, because he had claimed me so publicly, they had put a target directly on my back. The danger was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was following me home. For the next few days, the house felt like a gilded cage. Jinwoo's security detail, usually a discreet presence, was suddenly everywhere. A black car followed me whenever I left, a shadow I could feel even when I couldn't see it. The freedom I had sought with the purchase of the Bentley felt like a mockery. The car sat in the garage, a beautiful, silent testament to my captivity. I felt a desperate need to reclaim a piece of my old life, a life where my biggest problem was a condescending salesman. I was an architectural historian by training, and my favorite place in the city was a small, private gallery that specialized in historical blueprints and sketches. It was a quiet, forgotten corner of the world that had always been my sanctuary. I told Jinwoo I was going. He didn't try to stop me, but his eyes were grim. Calm will drive you, he said. Do not leave his sight. Calm was his head of security, a mountain of a man who looked like he could stop a truck with his forehead. The drive to the gallery was tense. I watched the mirrors, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I saw it almost immediately. A dark blue sedan, keeping a steady 2-car distance behind us. The Choi family. I felt a surge of cold fear, followed by a surprising wave of pure, defiant anger. They wanted to make me a victim, a pawn in their savage game with my husband. They thought I was his weakness. I would not be. When we arrived at the gallery, I told Kong, "Wait here. I'll be 20 minutes." He started to protest, but I gave him a look I had learned from my husband. A look of quiet, unarguable command. 20 minutes, I repeated and walked inside before he could argue further. The gallery was just as I remembered it. The quiet scent of old paper and wood polish, the soft lighting on the framed sketches of buildings that were now dust. But I couldn't relax. I felt watched. Through the large plate glass window at the front, I saw the blue sedan park across the street. 2 men got out. They didn't look at the gallery, but their posture was coiled, waiting. My mind raced. I could panic. I could run back to Kong and the safety of our armored car. But that was what they expected. For me to run to my protector. To prove I was nothing more than something to be protected. Instead, I thought about the building. I had studied its history. It was one of the oldest commercial structures in the district, built in the 1920s. I remembered reading about a service alley, a relic from the days of coal delivery, that connected the back of the building to the next street over. It was a quirk of urban planning, a forgotten artery in the city's heart. A path a car could not follow. I walked calmly to the back of the gallery, past the startled curator. There was a heavy steel door marked staff only. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the curator asked. "No," I said, my voice steady. "Just admiring the architecture." I slipped through the door and found myself in a small storage room. At the far end was another door, bolted but not locked. I slid the heavy bolt and stepped out into the alley. It was narrow and dark, smelling of damp concrete and refuse. I walked quickly, my heels clicking on the grimy pavement. The alley twisted, and for a moment, I was plunged into near darkness, the sounds of the city muffled and distant. I emerged onto a different street, a block away from where Kong was parked. The blue sedan was nowhere in sight. I didn't run to a cafe or a shop. I walked 2 more blocks to a small, discreet hotel that I knew Jin Woo's organization owned, a designated safe spot. From the sterile anonymity of the lobby, I took out my phone. I didn't call Jin Woo. I called Kong. "They're parked across from the gallery," I said, my voice low and urgent. 2 men, blue sedan license plate. I recited the plate number Choi's lieutenant had mentioned. "They think I'm still inside. They're waiting for me to come out the front." There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. Then, "How did you?" "Just get them," I said and hung up. I had done something. I hadn't been rescued. I had used my own knowledge, my own intelligence, to turn their trap back on them. I was not a passive victim. I was a player in the game. I had acted decisively, and in doing so, changed the outcome. Less than an hour later, Jin Woo found me. He didn't send a car. He came himself. He walked into the hotel lobby, and just like in the showroom, the atmosphere shifted around him. He saw me sitting in a low armchair, and his relentless pace slowed. He stopped in front of me, his face a mask of control, but his eyes were burning. He scanned me from head to toe, as if checking for injuries. "They've been taken care of," he said. It was not a boast. It was a simple, brutal fact. "I know," I said. We stood there for a long moment, the silent hum of the hotel lobby the only sound. He was looking at me differently. The way he'd looked at me before was possessive, protective. This was new. It was respect. "You saw the tail," he said. "You didn't panic. You remembered the building's layout. You called Kong, not me, and gave him tactical information." He was not asking. He was listing the facts, fitting the pieces together. He saw not what his rivals saw, a weakness, but what I had just proven myself to be. "They thought you were a liability," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A soft target to get to me." He took a step closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to look up at him. "They were wrong. You are not a liability." He reached out, and his fingers gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was featherlight, but it sent a shockwave through me. "You are a queen," he breathed, his eyes holding mine captive. My queen. The cost of that title was immense. My old life was gone, burned away in the fires of his world. My innocence, my simple moral compass, had been irrevocably compromised. I had accepted the violence, used the resources it provided, and found a grim satisfaction in it. Nothing in his world was free, and I was paying with the person I used to be. That night, back at the house, I walked into the cavernous garage. The red Bentley was parked in its designated spot, its flawless paint job gleaming under the recessed lighting. It was a stunning, savage thing, a monument to a day of humiliation and terrifying power. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. The rich scent of leather enveloped me. The silence inside the car was absolute, a pocket of stillness in a violent world. I didn't put the key in ignition. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, my hands on the smooth, cool leather of the steering wheel. Jin Woo had acknowledged what I was to him. No longer deniable, no longer hidden behind the polite fiction of our arranged marriage. I was his. But in that garage, in the driver's seat of a car bought with fear and blood, I understood a more profound truth. In choosing to stay, in choosing to act, in choosing to be his queen, I had finally irrevocably claimed myself. This car wasn't a gift. It wasn't a prize. It was a throne. And it was heavier than I could have ever imagined.